It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Anna Lewis, who's a bioethicist here at the Broad and also working at Harvard University. And she's going to moderate this session, and I'm going to let you introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Heidi. And thanks to Heidi and Ben for giving bioethics a spot in the limelight today. So just to quickly reflect why bioethics. Well, with the amazing scientific and technological leadership that the Broad and MPG show comes both the responsibility and the opportunity to maybe also be leaders in thinking through how the science and the technology can and should impact the lives of patients and everybody else. And that's particularly important for, as we were hearing about this morning, a mission-driven organization like the Broad, where the mission is explicitly tied to impacting patients' lives. And I was very interested to see in Nancy's talk, she explicitly couched everything she was saying in ethical terms. And I think that's including her action call to all of us about what's important. And then in Todd's remarks, one of the things he focused on in the challenges ahead for MPG was integrating diverse worldviews and perspectives. And that's something that's core to bioethics, is seeking out stakeholder input, be those stakeholders people from other disciplines, patients, research participants, and providers. So why this topic then, conducting valued-aligned research in MPG? Well, I was also interested to see that Heidi, in her remarks this morning, talking about the links to industry for a community like this, also talked explicitly in terms of value alignment. And in Mark's responses, he talked about finding solutions that align with the diverse values of multiple different parties. And we've just launched this year the Broad Bioethics Initiative that Alham and I co-lead. And thinking in terms of value-aligned research is really one of our main frames of thinking about things. So we wanted to use this panel as an opportunity to talk about that with you all. So let me introduce our panelists today. We've got John Basl from the University of Northeastern. He's a professor of philosophy. Insoo Hyun is at the, going to get the center's name right, the director of the Center for Life Sciences and Public Learning at the Museum of Science. Maya Sabatello is a professor at Columbia in clinical bioethics. And Alham Saadat, who'll be known to many of you, is the associate director of scientific equity here at the Broad. So the way this is going to work is that each of our panelists is going to have a few minutes up at the podium to share some thoughts. And then we're going to very rapidly move to Q&A from you all. So please be putting your question formulating caps on. With that, I'll pass to John.
Thank you. Everyone hear me okay? So I'm John Basl. I'm a moral philosopher, obviously. I'm not a bioethicist. I mean, I work in bioethics adjacent areas. I work in AI and data ethics mostly. But I was asked to talk a bit about values, what they are, why I think in terms of values. And a thing that I often say in AI and data ethics is that we lack what I call an ethics ecosystem. And an ethics ecosystem is a system of coordinated components that distribute the job of doing ethics so that not any individual practitioner has to do anything. And I think when you have a robust ethics ecosystem, it's less important to think in terms of values. And by values, I just mean the things that justify, ground, motivate the work we do, the things that are ultimately make them worth pursuing. So the reason we like science is because we value truth, or truth is valuable, and it's a useful set of tools for getting at truth. If truth weren't valuable, then science would be a pretty crappy practice. We'd be finding truth and we wouldn't want it. And the same is true for our ethical values, justice, welfare, fairness, things like that. So when we have an ethics ecosystem, we can tell practitioners to think in terms of rules, and we can give specific guidelines that they can follow. The problem is when you're doing work at the cutting edge, the rules we develop for those ethics ecosystems often fail. They fall apart. They don't work. They don't provide useful guidance. They provide guidance, but it doesn't actually get at the things that they were built to capture, which is fundamentally value. So if you've all been through IRB training, probably many times, and you get the story about the fundamental values and how that translates and justifies specific rules for intervention, like what informed consent policies are, what it means to think about non-maleficence, what it thinks to think about vulnerable populations. In the context for which bioethical norms were developed, You don't have to think about values. You get the operationalized principles, you get the principles, you get the action guiding rules. But when you're doing, but those tools were not developed for cutting edge research. They were not developed for genomics. This is why, for example, the All of Us program is trying to rethink, like, what is socially stigmatizing research, for example. And when you're doing that, it's extremely important to think in terms of values, because ultimately that's what you're trying to preserve, promote, and protect. And so the thing I just want to sort of push at is the reason for thinking about value-aligned research is because we're not in a spot where we can just offload the work to rules or norms or easy guidance. And so our North Star has to be thinking about how what we're doing promotes, protects, and respects fundamental values. So I'll leave it there and turn it to Q&A later.
Hey everybody, I'm Insoo Hyun. Like John, I'm a philosopher by training, and prior to being at the museum, I was the Director of Research Ethics at Harvard Medical School Center for Bioethics. So I got into the area that I focused on primarily as an academic, which is stem cell and regenerative medicine, ethics and policy. In 2005, I was actually in South Korea at the time when the Korean team at Seoul National University announced that they had cloned human embryos and got patient-specific stem cell lines from them, and then that was all exposed in the fall of 2005 as being fraudulent, and they've fabricated the results and the images and pulled their 2 articles from Science because of that. And from that experience, because I was there basically to kind of help them set up an ethics program, ironically, when the whole edifice came crashing down, everybody was quite shocked at what had happened. I got recruited by the International Society for Stem Cell Research, ISSCR. At that time, the incoming president was George Daly, who's now dean of Harvard Medical School. And we pulled together an international task force to come up with guidelines for stem cell research, for basic research, and then later it became guidelines for clinical translation, and now it's kind of the 4th version is all together, all bench-side research all the way to clinical trials. And the reason for having the guidelines is that we realized we have to have a common set of ethical principles internationally to help guide the research forward, not only to avoid embarrassing events like the Woo-Seok-Hwang scandal in South Korea, but also to just make international coordination of research and a publication of results much less uncertain, and kind of on common ground of a common language of values that everyone can draw from. Now, we didn't have to reinvent the wheel here because there are international standards for research ethics. We just wanted to sort of make them a little bit more stem cell specific. And so I was, from 2005 to 2006, I was the chair of the committee for ISSCR, which came up with standards for the procurement of human biomaterials for stem cell research. Eggs, embryos, sperm, somatic cells, everything you can imagine to start a stem cell line. And from there, I was involved in every iteration of the guidelines afterwards. But basically, our goal was to make ethics not get in the way of science, but to help pave the way. If done right, it actually facilitates collaboration. It facilitates standards for publication. In fact, the ISSCR guidelines are now the go-to standard for all the nature journals to make sure that any embryo or any kind of stem cell related manuscripts that come in have to show that they are in compliance with the ISSCR guidelines, and I often review for that standard. So when you look at our guidelines document, which is on isscr.org, you can find it under guidelines, you'll see at the very beginning we have an articulation of our guiding values or guiding principles. These are not new to the stem cell research world. In fact, they're very common across all biomedical research. Respect for persons and research participants, primacy of patient welfare in the context of clinical trials. But I wanted to zero in on just one example of how the values translated and continue to translate into cutting-edge research today. So surprisingly to many people, among the ethical values and principles that we list is integrity of the scientific process, scientific integrity. What I find fascinating about articulating that up front is that to me, as a bioethicist working closely with the researchers over almost 20 years, I've realized it's not a very clean separation for me between what is a purely scientific technical issue and what is an ethical one. Even your statistical robustness of the study is, and the experimental validity is extremely ethically salient because you're using precious resources along the way, exposing human subjects to more than minimal risk, et cetera, right? So they sort of blur together to me. They're sort of like two sides of the same coin. When we say integrity of the research process, one of the things that comes out of that in the guidelines is that your research protocol has to be very well strongly justified of why this next step, which might be actually pretty controversial, is necessary to answer an ongoing narrative of a scientific problem that people have been addressing for years. It's not just random. It doesn't just come out of nowhere. So as part of that, as some of you may know, there's a lot of news right now around stem cell-based embryo models. You can take any somatic cell, make it into an iPS cell, put those iPS cells or other pluripotent stem cells closely together, and then they start recapitulating the very early stages of embryonic development, either pre-implantation or post-implantation models. Now, this work, which is highly relevant, so interesting for many, many scientists, whether you're a developmental biologist or you're really interested in creating an embryo model for drug screening, or you're really interested in getting germ cells that just get pumped out of these models at the very early stages. Lots of scientific interest. There's a lot of uncertainty around this. So what the guidelines say is scientific integrity means you have to justify why your model needs to be that complex. If your scientific question could be answered by a much less complete, much less complex model, do that. Right? So that's just one example. There's so many all throughout the guidelines, how we take a value and then bring it down to earth in the lab through the guidelines, and then translate that into standards for publication in major journals. There's such a really interesting ecosystem there of values, policies, people involved, networking, that we just hope that the guidelines really help people think through very carefully. So with that, I'm just going to stop because I'm out of time. Happy to take Q&A later.
Hi, everyone. What an honor to be here. Difficult to pass through and continue from the great place of this morning, and of course, my colleagues here who just spoke. So I was asked very specifically to discuss, I'll say first of all myself, I'm a researcher, social science researcher focusing on the ethical, legal, and social implications of genetics, with a particular focus on people with disabilities, and one of the largest health disparity populations that we have in the country and in the world. And my research is entirely community engaged, meaning I'm working with communities directly before the grant submission, throughout the grant cycle, and of course after the grant ends as well. And I've been asked to speak about whose values matter and how we can go about engaging with various stakeholders on this front and give specific examples. So I wanted to think about three key values that at least inform my work, working again with this very specific community where we have very contrasting models for understanding disability. From a scientific perspective, we looked at the underpinning causes of disability, trying to identify the biological and genetic causes of it in order to eliminate it. From a disability perspective, when we think about people with disabilities, we have to think about the social, environmental, communicational barriers that disable people with disabilities from actually fully engaging in life and in all aspects of life, including research. So the three key values that really inform my work come from working with these communities. And the first one is actually something that sounds completely obvious, and I think John mentioned that as well as one of the key principles in research is respect for the person, for human subjects, which in our normal terms comes to say, we need your informed consent, signed off, this long page document, and so forth. But when I'm thinking about disability communities that I've been working with, I think respect for human subjects is really beyond that ICF. And it's not just the length of the ICF that no one understands, but it's actually how we think about that respect. And for me, when we think about respect, we mean developing understanding of accessibility and accommodations for people with disabilities. It means understanding the internal politics of this community. And it means that we ensure that we create inclusive study designs, including the ICFs, that actually allow them to participate as equal partners. So instead of thinking, for example, about why do blind people in so many FDA studies and our studies required to have a witness when they sign a consent form, we have to ask, why did we not make an audio recording of the consent form or created a consent form that's accessible for them in order to actually be equal members as everyone else? A second value that I cherish in my work is really the multi-stakeholder dialogue, and it comes from the perspective of human rights. There's been a whole conversation about whether we have universal human rights or cross-cultural human rights and how we have to address that. But Raymond Paniker, who was actually a Spanish Roman Catholic priest, and he was a proponent of interfaith dialogue, he used the analogy of windows, right? When we think about human rights and social justice and racial justice, we think about things through different windows. And the windows we look through come with all our baggage, with our cultural values, with how we think about things, with how we think things should be done, what they mean, and how they mean. And in fact, even if we look through the same window, we're likely to see things very differently. So when we think about research, genetic research, precision medicine research in particular, we also have to think about the idea that we have multiple windows to think about the value and the importance of particular studies. So I think one core issue for me here in that context is to really think about, we're often going to have different point of views when we come to a table and think about genomic research. But what we have to think about is how do we create a bidirectional interaction where we can actually hear the diverse voices? Because the option that we have is to smash all the windows of all of us and create one universal rules, which won't apply, or actually have room to learn about the different perspectives and think about whether or not we can reach some sort of shared values, and if not, at least agree that we disagree and find practical ways forward. I know that Alham is going to discuss a more specific example, so I'm going to let her have that, and I'm happy to circle that back later on as well. And then the third value that really informs my work is the need for empowerment in social or disability justice within our studies and beyond it. And what it means is, again, we've all heard about the principle of justice in research. That's one of the core bioethical principles. But we rarely actually implement it in the broader way of thinking about how does our research really impact the community. And with a disability community where we have a lot of biases, a lot of disagreements, and a lot of challenges of actually creating accessible studies, because many of us are unaware of how to do that, I think one of the things that I really put an emphasis is on how do we actually make it accessible for increase the empowerment of that community broadly defined. So that means not only having them in my studies, that's my bread and butter, and I love working with them, but actually how do we ensure that they're included in other studies that are not disability focused, but actually those studies that are open for the general public and where people with disabilities are directly and indirectly excluded from? How do we create those studies to be more inclusive? And also increasing data personalization. So for example, when we do we write a publication, I use the terminology that the participants in my studies prefer to use. For example, in one of the study of the deaf community, they prefer the deaf person, deaf individual, and so forth. Publishers tend to switch it into persons who are deaf, right? From a medical perspective, we often use people with hearing loss. These are terms that might be offensive to some of the community members. So just in thinking about how do we recreate this power imbalance, how do we empower those participants to feel that their voice has been heard not only in my studies, but beyond it, we actually increasingly put a statement in our studies and data sharing that researchers will have to use the preferred language of our participants. And again, it just transfers the message that there's a voice, and we're helping them exercising their voice in the way that they want to hear it. With that, I'll give the room to Alham. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Maya, and everyone for the really important comments on why value-aligned research is important and the specific case example of how to do it effectively and thoughtfully, particularly in the context of thinking about disabilities communities. I'll end this introductory section with a specific kind of case example that I think for me really helped outline how folks can think about, so values are important, we can all agree on that, and we all have different values that we carry forward in our work. What do we do, though, in cases where there are simultaneously important values that you need to prioritize? So you can go through the prioritization process of kind of weighing and balancing and come to a decision. But when in many cases they're equally important, particularly in cases where in sensitive research areas, like for example genetics of autism or social and behavioral genomics, you really are in domains that are quite ethically complex. And so how do you make hard decisions, and then what are the steps that are important to think about after you make those hard decisions? So everyone, as Maya mentioned, is going to bring their own kind of social and historical context to this decision-making process, how they weigh and balance the values that are important in the context of the work that they're doing. And so there's that aspect. But I think, I'd like this case study to focus on what do you do after the hard decision? So when you've prioritized one value over another, they're both important. What are some next steps you can take that help mitigate some of the harms that were introduced in that process? So I had a really fantastic conversation with some fellow Broad researchers in the NDV program yesterday. These are folks that are working in autism research, specifically in the genetics of autism, and they've been kind of navigating some pretty ethically complex domains around thinking about really diverse values, even among the communities that their work aims to serve. So you have folks whose families are desperate to find, a better understanding of what's driving extreme neurodevelopmental symptoms in their families and children, and then you have that juxtaposed with folks that are kind of autism advocacy groups that are really thinking about autism very differently and thinking about it less as a disability and more of a part of their identity. And when they think about autism research, they think of it, borderline kind of eugenics aligned. So how do you navigate those different kind of spaces in a way that balances the values of both of those communities? And I think Elise Robinson, made a comment that in her work she did something which is make the hard decision that she has really foundational reasons for why autism genetics research and studying the genetics of autism is important. She's established that for herself and for her group and can kind of reason through that. And the way that she has continued to kind of think about mitigation of harms with the communities that are impacted is continue conversations with those groups, particularly the groups that disagree with kind of her research areas. And I think the comment that stands out for me was something she said that she has learned the most from the people that she's disagreed with the most. And she continues to have really thoughtful, engaged conversations, and the relationships with these folks that there is a disagreement there is a difference in values, but that she continues to learn, and also those conversations and those relationships, that community engagement has continued to inform her and her research group's work. So I think values are important for research, but I think it's really important to recognize that there will be conflicts, and in places of conflict, you can make the hard decisions. Those are necessary to move work forward, but that with that, you can also kind of take some next steps to think about what are ways that I can mitigate some of the unintentional harms that may come from those hard decisions. So that was my case example, and I think Anna already mentioned this, but for research domains, particularly sensitive research areas like genetics of autism and social and behavioral genomics, things like that, I think they are really complex, and the researchers in these areas are working hard to address the ethical complexities. And as Anna mentioned, if folks ever need a partner and kind of thinking through some of those domains, our recently launched Broad Research Ethics Consultancy is happy to help folks navigate some of those challenging areas, and looking forward to the rest of the panel discussion. Thank you.
Let's say thanks to all the panelists. Yeah. Great. Well, I'm going to ask one question, and then I hope that some of you are going to come up to a microphone and ask some other questions. Okay, so you're a medical and population genomicist, maybe sitting in the audience, and you're like, yeah, I'm totally on board. I want to be doing value-aligned research. Do you have any practical tips or thoughts or recommendations for how to get going with that explicit framework?
Are you
to anybody? Yeah.
Okay. Well, what I would suggest is, You don't. I mentioned this a little bit in my little opening statement. You don't have to start from scratch. I mean, what I would recommend is you look around and see, well, what currently is kind of the common practice or the common values that are driving the research, and then you look for areas that maybe need further clarification depending on the exact area of study that you're looking at, or if there are any like gaps in kind of how people think about the research to fill that in. But I would start with kind of what is currently the standard, what is currently out there. We found that really useful in the stem cell guideline space because we're just adding to the wealth of values, the wealth of perspectives that's already come before us in animal research and human subjects research, tissue culture research, which there's actually not that much there, so we had to add to that. So kind of look at what's currently available and then build on that.
I think it is true you should start looking for existing models, and there's lots out there, but there's also a risk that comes with that, which is that if there's sufficiently different interactions between what you're doing and the fundamental values, like in the AI ethics space, this is just everywhere. Like informed consent has become notice and consent, and it doesn't protect. It's nothing like informed consent or anonymization. You do not need anybody's personal identifiers to do really invasive inferences about them. So I think that's right to start with what's already out there, but just have in the back of your head that if it feels like the stuff you're doing is sufficiently different or interacts with the values in a way that just isn't quite right, the unfortunate thing is I don't have practical advice for you, but that's not why they ask philosophers to come. You're really stuck having to sort of identify partners to navigate those things with you. Yeah.
And I think I also suggest actually starting from the end goal. That is, where do you want to go, and what's missing that you want to achieve, and then try to figure out what hasn't been done yet. Because I think part of the issue is that, again, if we're falling into the rules, existing values, practices, and so forth, we're just likely to replicate whatever has gone wrong so far. So we really have to think about where we want to get, what do we want to have change at the end, and then how we can redo it.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with Maya, just really thinking about what are the goals and working back from there. And also, again, that really important piece of doing this in community, in conversation with communities that are going to be most impacted by your work, because you can get into kind of an academic tunnel where you lose track of kind of what is the point of the values that I'm trying to uphold. You're upholding values because you're trying to be intentionally aware of harm aversion and providing some benefit to the communities you aim to serve. So really doing all the things that were described, and then also the sanity check of thoughtful community engagement that really provides that feedback on whether what you're thinking is actually well aligned with the outcomes that you hope for.
And I just want to add one more thing about the community engagement, if I can, since you mentioned that. Obviously, I think that's critically important. I also think that we have to think about not creating communities that are convenient for our ultimate goals. That is, finding community members who just agree with us is exactly a part of the issue and a part of the challenge. So I think sometimes bringing the disagreeing parties within the communities into the same table can be very fruitful. I think autism research is absolutely a great example. It's very controversial, the autism research itself. But if you speak with the folks, there are some core issues that ultimately remain across the board, which is the need for inclusion of whoever exists, as well as the need for, or at least support for, some genomic research to address other health issues. That is, not focusing necessarily just on the autism, but actually on other health needs. And I think that's something that can get more universal acceptance across the board. So again, bringing folks with diverse views from the same community can be very informative.
Any questions, please? Oh, yes, Eric.
Thank you all for joining us. It's really an interesting discussion. I've got a bunch of questions. I'm trying to figure out which one is the most important because I don't want to monopolize the question time. So let me try this one. So as we do clinical trials in my field of ophthalmology, using precision medicine to treat inherited blinding disorders, we're constantly confronted with the challenge of what's the right outcome measure to demonstrate efficacy or not of the intervention we're testing. And the FDA has a bunch of standard outcome measures like, can you read a chart better? But as I work with the patients and their families on these studies more, I'm increasingly impressed by how important patient-reported outcomes are. And I sort of have a question, I guess. Do you consider patient-reported outcomes part of value-aligned research? And if so, can you give us some insight or guidance into how to make those more accepted as clinical study endpoints across the whole spectrum of disease? And do you think it's realistic to have a goal of working with the FDA over the next generation to bring those into primary outcome measures?
This is a question designed for Maya.
Thank you. I think that's a great question. And I think user-friendly or user outcome evaluations are really wonderful ways of learning if we're actually doing what communities want, right? So I think one way of doing it is before you start even the study, meet with folks with a condition and try to get from them, not through a would you like this and that, but what, have open conversation about what a success would look like from their perspectives. Create measures accordingly and just edit your studies. I think ultimately you can then compare were your goals of success similar to the goals of success of the participants, and where were the differences? And I think that's something that from a research design is completely valid, but also it will inform, again, future research in terms of how do we engage with those communities and assess really what is a successful study.
So maybe continuing on with this question of the patient-aligned goals, one challenge I've experienced is when you're interacting with patient communities that don't align themselves within their community, right? And an example we were doing a study in cardiomyopathy with sperm donors. In this case, a particular sperm donor gave rise to 24 children, half of whom had cardiomyopathy, one died, another were at risk. These families were really wanting to raise awareness of cardiomyopathy and the risk for sudden cardiac death in their children. And so, the study got, I was asked to go on the Today Show and talk about this, and the families were really supportive because they wanted to get word out. And then one family did not want me to go on the Today Show and said she would sue me if I went on the Today Show because she didn't want her daughter to feel anxious about her condition and feel more at risk for sudden cardiac death because it was being made, a highlight in this Today Show. And so I've, two family populations that are in absolute stark contrast in terms of the outcomes. And so what do you do as a researcher, and this is maybe an extreme example, it's a real example, but do you feel like it is your role or responsibility to try to bring your community together in some way? Or are you simply there to hear all the different views and then you make your own decision? How much do you try to bring a community together when they have very different views versus just listen to all and do the best you can?
I have some thoughts on that. I think that is not dissimilar to kind of the extreme kind of two sides in the autism communities, right? The family advocates versus like the individual advocates. I think I think the goal is not to necessarily bring the diverse communities together, but to hear, as a researcher, hear the perspectives of both, really listen, take away the things that are kind of the core pieces of that. And then there's going to be hard decisions that are made, right? That we don't have in research, you have to kind of, in this case, it was, a media kind of decision, but in research, you do have to make a decision about where you go next. So a hard decision is made, but continue to have conversations, particularly with the people that are disagreeing with your take on something, because that's the space for most learning. And I think this is just beyond research. I think this is something that our society as a whole could benefit from, is listening to people that we disagree with, really genuinely listening and kind of learning from them. Because there's a lot you can take away. And one other point around that, Heidi, is this idea of this I think fiction of homogenous communities, right? The autism community or the blank community. We're all heterogeneous, right? Like we have different perspectives on different things. So not treating a community as homogenous, I think, is also really important, and making space to hear that diversity is key as well.
Can I just, a couple things. Like first on participation, I think we have to be very careful. Like, we don't want to turn participation into a decision mechanism because that can become ethics washing. Like, I don't want to make the hard decision, so I'm going to turn it over to the community. So if they're aligned, then obviously I'll just do what they say. Like, I think it's really a lot to put on individual researchers to have to both try to create alignment in the community, try to do the social. It's like a social scientist is required to actually get the information you need about communities to responsibly report it. So I think the real answer is, how do I build up a system of subsystems that can help me answer these questions? It can't be on every single genomicist to try to navigate each of these issues or be a community interventionist. Most of you aren't trained to, I'm not trained to do that. I should never be put in front of a group of the public where it's my job to help come to value alignment. I can produce arguments, I can help talk to the people who are good at that. But I think the real answer is that, like, ultimately, if it's your lab, you have to make a decision, but it's really about, how do I set up the processes that are going to help me get the information out, that are going to make appropriate judgments about how to interact with that community. But it can't be that that's all on you.
The other thing, if you hear from them specific concerns, the question is if there's any way of addressing them before you go online. So, if she says, the issue is she'll get stressed, the question is, why would she get stressed? Who's going to tell her how, why, at what time? There are a lot of questions that can be addressed in that conversation, and I think that's one of the things that are helpful exactly in those conversations.
Time for one more question, if anybody in the audience.
Thanks so much. And it's building off a little bit, John, what you're talking about in terms of having expertise to conduct value-aligned research. But I think all of us genomicists or in the room, we all want to do value-aligned research, and we're all well-meaning, and this all resonates. But you talked about how to do it, but what are some common missteps that well-meaning folks like us constantly traps we fall into, things that we do wrong that we could leave saying don't be like the 13th person to do that kind of thing.
Yeah, I've got one from the disability community. So often when I come down to someone and say, well, ultimately most of the general human rights cohorts, human cohorts are really exclusionary of people with disabilities. The first response that I get, so where can we find them? Can we just map out all the blind schools in the city? Can we somehow map all the deaf institutions in the country and recruit them? That's great for if you think about recruitmentology alone. But if you actually want to recruit those folks, you have to learn them before, understand them before, do the homework before. And I think before you even reach out to them, you have to make sure that your study is accessible for what they need. I just have a study now that I was supposed to be, I'm obviously fully trying to be accessible. The company assured that they're accessible. They just forgot to do user testers before confirming that it's indeed accessible. So obviously that's not going to work, but I think the lesson is to always double check yourself, but also make sure that your systems are geared and tailored to that community before you reach out to them. Inviting them to do something that they cannot do is worse than not inviting.
I've got another example. Figure 2 of the All of Us paper that came out in Nature Medicine a few days ago. If you haven't been on Twitter, you can find it exploded on this topic. It was a figure that kind of reinforced links between genetically inferred continental ancestry categories and race and ethnicity. And I just learned this morning from one of the prior speakers that they're actually going to reissue that figure, redo some of the writings, and seriously alter that paper. And one of the things they did in that paper is they didn't include a bunch of people who are involved in All of Us, as PIs included, who would have caught that straight away. So yeah, don't be that person. Actually, Ben, I do think John, one more example, and then Ben, you can have a closing thought or question.
So I think big picture, coming from the outside from bioethics, one of the things I encounter a lot, which makes total sense. When you're in bioethics, you're enculturated. When you're in medicine, you're enculturated into an ecosystem that emphasizes certain values. It makes sense that we train scientists to care a ton about scientific values as the dominant kind of value. And it makes sense that we train doctors to care about saving lives. But then when you step back to think about policy decisions, you have to set those value commitments aside, because it's not true that scientific values override ethical values, or that saving lives is the most important policy consideration. So I think it's about knowing when to deploy your ethics resources that you've been really trained to deploy in specific contexts, and when to sort of step back and be like, okay, this is an open question. I don't have good judgments here, even though the values that I've been enculturated into really speak to me here.
I think that's a great point, and I think the other thing, though, that maybe deserves elevation in that is that there are prevailing narratives. And some of those narratives, in the case of what you were describing, Alham, with autism, the narrative from a segment of that community is that this research is explicitly intended to engage in eugenics. And that is not the intent of the research. And indeed, in the debate about that, the frequency with which I saw members of the, say, bioethics community come out and say, that's not what the scientists are trying to do, was pretty uncommon. And so I guess the question I might pose is, as people that are engaged in the bioethical landscape and the desire to, in a sense, protect the most vulnerable people in our society, which I think a lot of us in this room share, is there some quarter for protecting the scientists that are being maybe subject to character assassination at the same time?
Is it the terminology that it's so painful? Because eugenics is a hard word. But ultimately, if we're trying to eradicate in some way an entire population, then I think that's where the pain is, right?
That's not the intent of the research. The point that I'm making is that that is not the intent of the research. The intent of the research is to help people that want help.
That's where the ethics and the policy and the social structures come into place, because if you look into health insurance company, they do pressure people to do certain actions based on those results. So I don't think that there's any scientific researcher who will say, I just want to kill all of those. That's definitely not the intention. Absolutely agree with you. But I think there are a lot of social forces that ultimately might lead to the same outcome. If you think about folks with Down syndrome, where 94% of pregnancies with children with Down syndromes or fetuses with Down syndrome are being aborted, then that's one of the reasons. And it's happening also in countries where you have a proper social network, right? So there are more social forces that play a role here. And I think that's the concern, because the less of the population we have, the less social investment we have in those who exist. And that's where the problem becomes more controversial. And I'll stop there.
I have a closing thought, but maybe one of the three of you others have a thought on Ben's question.
I think, Ben, it's a really important point, and it's a hard question. I think one thing that also can help in this space is really effective scientific communication from the scientific community to really engage with people outside of scientific domains. The less we can jargonify the terminologies, the words that we use, and the more people understand the research that we're doing, I think you actually close a lot of those gaps between scientists and kind of lay people in society. I think that's great for a lot of reasons. Again, you know, the trust in science is trending down kind of broadly. So I think really being mindful of how we talk about our work in ways that are understandable for a broad audience is also a huge part of this. But it's a hard question. And yeah, I think we could spend an hour talking about that point alone.
John or Insoo, any thoughts? No. Yeah, you can quickly.
Coming from the other direction, and again from the other side of this, another space, is that there is a huge role for educating the public in ways that they can better engage and advocate for themselves. So there's so many failures in the tech ethics space because the public doesn't understand the technologies and so can't advocate or engage in the responsibility. And I think part of that is like there is good grounds for STEM education, and part of it is enabling community engagement in a sort of on a levelish playing field.
And we've mentioned a lot about values being in conflict. I actually find that values usually are not in that much conflict. What's in conflict is what people believe is true. So actually, I think most people agree about fundamental values.
Well, that sounds like a great note to end on. Thanks, everybody.